As a trauma survivor, I have always been interested in resilience. But growing up, I believed it was something that you were born with. Then in graduate school, I learned that it was a quality that we all possess and a set of skills we can all strengthen. Most of my resilience has come from writing and seeing myself in new ways by confronting the stories I've always told myself. The more I did that, the stronger I became, and I've dedicated my life to helping others do this work. This podcast is for anyone who wants to understand their story and how to revise it, because when we do that work, we change the world. I first met Melanie Brooks after hearing her on the debut author panel during the 2017 Hippocamp Literary Conference. At the time, she was reading from her first book, Writing Hard Stories, Celebrated Memoirists Who Shape Art from Trauma. She took on this project while earning her MFA through University of Southern Maine's Stonecoast Masters in Fine Arts program after struggling to write a memoir about her father's death during the HIV/AIDS epidemic. Immediately recognizing its power, I bought a copy of this book. I have since used it as inspiration for my own writing and to empower the writers I work with. Over the years, I've gotten to know Melanie and have the privilege of calling her my friend. We've spoken about her approach to teaching professional writing at Northeastern University and creative nonfiction in the MFA program at Bay Path University in Massachusetts. Most recently, we talked about the certificate program she earned in narrative medicine through Columbia University. I've read the pieces she's published in Psychology Today, the HuffPost, Yankee Magazine, the Washington Post, Ms. Magazine, Creative Nonfiction, and many other places. It is my honor and delight to watch her come full circle by speaking to her during her book tour for A Hard Silence, One Daughter Remaps Family, Grief, and Faith When HIV/AIDS Changes It All. This is the book she once struggled to write about her father's death. In today's episode, we'll explore the powerful impact silence has on you and how to break through it. Before we get to this conversation, I have a few questions for you. What role has silence played in your writing and in your life? Has it ever been helpful? Has it ever held you back? And if you could learn one thing about it, what would that be? How could learning this help you become more resilient? I hope you ponder these questions as you listen to today's episode. And now I give you our conversation with Melanie Brooks. Are you a writer who struggles with doubts? Do you wonder if your stories are good enough? Do you wish you had some simple tricks that would make the writing life just a little bit easier? Become part of my Writing and Resilience community by signing up for my newsletter. As a thank you, you'll receive a free copy of Write More, Fret Less, 5 brain hacks that will supercharge your productivity, creativity, and confidence. The link is in the show notes. Well, hello there, Melanie Brooks. I am so glad that you're here with me today.
Hi, Lisa. It's great to see you.
I know the last time we saw each other, we were at AWP, which,
what
was that, March? I can't believe it was that long ago.
I know, it doesn't feel like it, but yeah, it was March. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me to be on this.
Well, I am delighted because I absolutely adore your book. And could you hold it up for us? I know that those of you who are listening can't see the beautiful, beautiful cover for A Hard Silence, but you must go out and buy this book if you haven't already. It is amazing. And Melanie, would you tell us a little bit about the book? I'm going to ask you about your publishing journey in a second, but tell us what you would like us to know about the book.
Well, so the context of the book is that in 1985, my father was infected with HIV through a blood transfusion after undergoing open heart surgery. And at the time, we were living in Canada, and the same stigma and isolation and ignorance that surrounded the disease for those people who lived through the epidemic here in the United States was happening in Canada as well. My father was a surgeon. He was at the height of his medical career, and he anticipated that he would be dead within months. He decided, because of the stigma associated, because he didn't want there to be any ill effects for him or for our family, that he would keep it a secret, that we would all keep it a secret. But he ended up living for 10 more years. So from the time I was 13 until I was 23, I carried this secret of my father's illness. So the hard silence is, that there wasn't any kind of conversation surrounding this catastrophe that had entered our lives and that we were living. And so the book is really, that's the context, but the book is really about me 20 years later, kind of looking back at that experience and interrogating kind of the consequences of living in silence and maintaining secrecy. And then how do you learn to kind of step out of that silence and voice your experience in an authentic way?
Yeah, that's one of the things I really love about the book is the structure, which we're going to talk about a little bit in a few minutes. But what stuck with me when I was reading the book, and also just hearing you talk about it now, is the power and the pain of living with a secret. Because the secret wasn't just with the outside world. There's a way that it existed within your family because no one was talking about it.
Right.
And what was that like for you to hold that secret? I mean, what story did that create for you as you were living it?
Kind of the big reason for that. So I have three brothers, and my youngest brother was only 8 at the time of my father's infection. And so my parents decided not to tell him.
Yeah.
And because of that, for 7 of the 10 years, they didn't end up telling him until he was 15. And so for 7 of those 10 years, it was a secret we had to keep within our family as well. So it couldn't be kind of like a conversation around the dinner table. And so it's interesting because I always think about the fact that, when you're living something, you're not fully aware of what you're living. And also, I don't think at that age I would have been able to articulate fully what that silence and secrecy was like. But it's when you look back and you kind of peel back those layers that you begin to understand how damaging that is. And for me, it became like a habit of silence around the big things in my life, around the things that were too hard to talk about. We just always kind of push them aside, put them away. And when you carry too much of that, it kind of simmers to the top eventually, and you can't keep going unless you focus in and face those things.
And as Bessel van der Kolk says, the body keeps the score, and boy, does it. And as I was listening to you, even now, just, embodying this sense of what is it like to hold a secret, something that resonates with me and the experiences I've had in my own life is just the tension of every muscle and the holding of every breath. Like when you live in secrets, you don't actually breathe.
We were holding our breath for different reasons too, right? We were holding our breath for, we couldn't breathe out this secret, but also for every single day of those 10 years, we anticipated my dad was going to get sick and die. It was waiting. It was this constant period of waiting too. So that was another kind of factor of holding your breath as you're, kind of that anticipatory grief. You know what's coming, because back then in 1985, there was no cocktail. There were no medications that were helping people live with HIV. And so it was 100% a death sentence. It was just a matter of when. And so it was kind of holding on to that knowledge, through that period of time and just waiting for the eventual outcome.
Yeah. And anticipatory grief, just there's so many layers of fear, and then just the agony, the pain of it again and again and again. And, there was so much terror during the AIDS crisis of the 1980s. And this is going to sound like a silly story, but to me it was big. And it just gives me just a taste, a tiny taste of what it must have been like for you and your family. Is when I first started hearing about AIDS and HIV, I was, I think, 7 or 8 years old when I first heard these words. And there were these candies, these diet AIDS. They were called AIDS, these little chocolates at the store. And I remember looking at those and thinking, oh my gosh, people are eating those candies and dying. Why are they still in the marketplace? Like, what is this?
Right.
And it's a silly thing, but it just points out how misunderstood this was and how many stories people were building, and how not only was it a horrific disease that was killing so many people in so many awful ways, but then there were so many of us who had these irrational stories around it. And so all of the responses that people had to the epidemic just compounded what your family was going through is, having someone who was HIV positive.
Right. And, because we weren't talking about it in my family, my knowledge of the disease came from the same place as everybody else's did, right? The media, the scary tabloid headlines, the way television was, kind of embodying the epidemic and various things, And so it was kind of like I was gaining my knowledge and understanding in very incremental phases.
Mhm.
And so to kind of learn this information, I'd learn a piece, but then I couldn't talk about it. And I couldn't. And I always want to qualify when I say that, because I think if I had wanted to talk about it, I don't think my parents would have said, like, no, we're not
Mhm.
speaking of it. Right. But I very quickly understood. Well, and I talk about this in the book too, that my parents never sat me down and told
Yeah.
me. I think at the time when they told my two older brothers, they thought, we won't tell Melanie and David, but somehow, like right at the beginning, and I think in the book I call it like a baffling hole in my,
Mhm.
right, that I found out. Whether I overheard something, but I knew very early. And eventually, I think my parents understood that I knew, but there was never a moment where we like sat down, talked about it. They said to me, if you have any questions, feel free to ask us. You can always come and talk to us, right? That invitation wasn't extended. And I think I internalized that as, this is a secret I'm really not supposed to know.
Mhm.
This is something I'm really not supposed to talk about. And so I didn't reach out with those kinds of
Yeah.
questions. I didn't, kind of approach them. I'm sure if I had, they most certainly would have talked to me about it.
That's the complicated thing about being in families and
Mhm.
and about our communication in general is that so many meta messages happen when we exist in silence. Like your parents would have talked to you had you asked. You feel confident about that. And yet, it was the fact that no one did that created this ambiance or this world where it didn't feel like you had permission to do that. And
Exactly.
so it's not like anyone was doing anything bad or trying to be harmful towards you. And yet, it's just that's how secrets perpetuate. It
And it's
isn't
kind of
always the first part. It's what's not spoken.
exactly. And it's kind of that feeling of like I'm carrying a secret that I'm really not supposed to be carrying,
Yeah.
So, and I think there was also kind of a deep understanding in me that my parents were really struggling with
Hmm.
this tragedy in our lives and everything that it entailed. And I didn't want to add to that struggle by struggling myself or
Yeah.
demonstrating that I was struggling myself.
You remained Melanie Joy Bells.
I did. Yeah.
I love that line. And that
Yeah.
just,
So that was my dad's nickname for me. My middle name is Joy. And so, I think it was very much my personality from an early age. I was a sunshiny little baby and, but I also recognized that that was a role I played in my family too. So,
and it's such a common role. There's so many people that play that role. And, your story is so layered. And that's one of the things I love about it. And we first met in 2017 at the Hippocampus Literary Conference. Hippocamp, if you've never been, writers, you should definitely go. And I
absolutely.
have a copy of your first book, which you notice is filled with dog, like little
Love that. I love
tags
seeing
and
it. Yep.
oh my gosh, so if you can't see it, I'm holding her book Writing Hard Stories, which is her first book, and I have all of these tabs in there which I use regularly with my students when I
Oh,
want to
that's
pull
so
stuff
nice.
out.
Thank
So it's
you.
not just for me, it's for others.
Yeah.
But what I remember from your reading during the debut author series was how that book was a way for you to gain insights into how to write this book because
Absolutely.
you were struggling with what to do with this. And
Right.
so this has been a journey, right? Because it was a journey that required you to write a book to write a book. So can you
Yep.
tell us a little bit about that journey of how you got from 2017 or before really until today?
So it really started in 2013 when I began my MFA. So that's when I first started kind of dipping my toes into the waters of writing this story. So I started an MFA in 2013. And it was during that MFA that I discovered what most writers of memoir discover that when you start digging into the past and you start revisiting very closely your hard memories, it's a really tough psychological journey.
Yes.
But it caught me very much by surprise because I was 20 years removed from my father's death. I had kind of felt like, oh, I know the story. I've lived the story. It was 20 years ago that dad died. So I wasn't expecting the emotional toll that really looking closely at my memories of that time and the subsequent grief that followed that time, I wasn't expecting the toll. And so as part of my MFA, we had to do this project in our third semester. We had to do more like a critical project. So my thesis was I was working on this memoir. So then I thought, well, maybe I could talk to some other writers who had written stories, that were as hard as mine or harder, and ask them what it was like for them. I really wanted to know that I wasn't this unique person. I wanted to know that what I was feeling was normal, I think. And so I started that process as just this little project. But what happened was I approached all these writers whose books I had been reading for my MFA. And they were all so incredibly generous with me. They all said yes, they'd talk to me. Not only did they say yes, they said, come to my house and sit and have lunch with me and we'll talk about it. Or, let's meet at this restaurant and we'll talk about it. And so I started having these amazing conversations with these wonderful writers. And I started realizing, kind of as I was gathering, their insights and their wisdom, that if somebody had given me a collection of these insights when I started my MFA, it would have helped me to kind of navigate that difficult territory of getting into that kind of psychological territory of unpacking traumatic memories and hard things. And so that's how that book originated. So it started as a very selfish endeavor. I wanted to do it for me. I wanted these writers to tell me I was going to survive the process, that I was going to feel better at the end. But what happened, I talk about it as it kind of like every conversation gave me just a little bit of a push to get back into my memoir, a little bit more encouragement and a little more courage to dig a little deeper, to go a little bit more into that vulnerable territory. And so I really did need that first book to get to this book.
Well, and I can attest to the fact that it was both personally helpful to me to read all of this. And I have many, many clients and students who are also grateful to you for all of the work that you did to put that together. There are so many gems in there. Oh my gosh, so many gems. And it gave me faith that when I was in the throes of working on my own book, that there was light at the end of the tunnel, that not only was I going to finish this thing, but I was going to feel different. And to me, that's the important part.
Well, and it's so interesting because kind of as I was having these interviews, that's the thing. Like one of the questions I asked all the writers was like, what did it feel like to finish? What did it feel like to publish this book? And all of them use some version of relief or freedom or, like a heaviness had been lifted, and since I was still so kind of in the thick of it, I was still really stuck in the weeds. I kind of would say like, oh, okay. I'll believe it. I held on to their words, but it's so true. When you come to this place where you can kind of take this book and hold it in your hands and know that you put all of that somewhere, it does change the way you carry that story and it changes the way you feel about it.
Absolutely. And not quite where you are yet. So I'm saying yet because I will get there, but I already feel that. And so that was your first book. And one of the things I want to let everyone know is if you aren't following Melanie on Instagram or some other form of social media, she has these amazing posts where it's kind of a full circle experience. They are writing these beautiful blurbs for her book. So I've seen Richard Hoffman, Abigail Thomas, Andre Dubus III, Michael Patrick, Alex Marzano-Lesnevich. I mean, you've got like this celebrity list of people who are giving you glowing praise, which is very deserved for this. But it took a while to get there, right? You wrote the first book. You had this great success. You had this huge contribution to the literary community. But that was 2017. It's 2023. Right. So, and you and I were in this cohort together. We were in this group where we were talking about it and you were beginning to send out submissions. Talk about that part of the process.
So it's been, the publication journey for me with this book has been very difficult. And maybe I should say it's been kind of a rutted, rocky road, as I should say. In 2017, when I first published Writing Heart Stories, I had a proposal for this book. I had an agent, he was gung ho, sure we were going to find a publisher for it, sent it out, started submitting. And it kept getting rejected, not with any big explanation. There wasn't kind of a like it would have been so helpful if there was
Mhm.
a clear reason why. But I think over time, what I kind of started to understand was, it was never something that anything that they said was never about the quality of the writing, which was encouraging.
Yeah.
Often I would receive these rejections, especially when I parted ways with my agent and I started
Mhm.
doing some submitting on my own. I would receive these rejections that if it didn't have the no in it, they would I would have used it as a beautiful review of my book. So it was encouraging to know that it wasn't the writing. I think that's what every writer kind of fears is, well, what if they hate the way I'm writing? What if I'm not a good writer? But I think on many levels, this was a hard story to sell. I think because HIV AIDS is no longer, kind of at the center of our public conversation, I think a lot of publishers kind of felt like there wasn't necessarily a market for a story like this, that it's kind of an old story in some ways. I think that was part of it. I know you and I have talked about the fact that books about grief are not always welcomed in the publishing world, in the same way that grief is kind of looked at in our society as something that we don't talk about a lot. I think it was also kind of that feeling in publishing, you know, we've done enough with grief. We don't want to hear any more about grief.
Yeah.
And so there were a number of reasons, but all of that to say that it was a 4-year process to find a publisher for this book. And I won't say that I was, submitting 100 submissions every day, kind of thing. There
Mhm.
were there were moments where I basically kind of put it away and decided to work on other things. And at one point, when my agent and I decided to part ways, I decided, because he had been submitting on proposal, I decided,
Mhm.
well, why don't I take time and finish the manuscript? So I took a full year to finish the manuscript and then started submitting myself. And so it took time. It took time. But, it's interesting when I think about it that it feels like right now is the right time. I mean, I could never have
Yes.
imagined in 2017 that a worldwide pandemic would make the AIDS epidemic more relevant, make people reflect back on what did we do then? What did we do?
Yes.
What did we do wrong? How can we do differently now? Right. And so I think that it resonates in this post-COVID time period. And I also just think I'm at a place where I feel really confident in this story and ready to talk about it.
And I definitely would say that your book needed a pandemic. I mean, just, there is a way that it speaks to the pandemic. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about my experience going through that and all of the things I didn't know that your book showed me. But I
Yeah,
was also thinking about what my experience was like in COVID and how we were doing a lot of the same things and kind of spinning our wheels in many of the same ways and the irrational fears that
yeah,
come about when you don't know and you are dealing with something that's deadly. And so I think that that's part of the magic about when things actually get published.
right.
And yet, highly talented people like yourself, and I'm going to
Thank
say
you.
myself too, when things don't go well, we can start to tell ourselves a story that isn't so great. And
Right.
how did you keep the faith that this book was worth selling, that it was going to be a great contribution, which it is, during this period when you were parting with your agent, you were sending things out, and you were navigating all of these rejections, which so many people do?
Yeah. Yeah. I think having a really strong writing community, having people who understand what it's like to get those rejections and to feel
Mhm.
that deflation because after you've been waiting and waiting, I think having that, I have some people in my life who have been just champions of this book for me, and who have believed in it when my belief was waning. And so I always say to people, like, find somebody who believes in your book more than you do,
Yes.
and that person will kind of stay with you. My beautiful friend Suzanne Strempick Shea is going to be doing my launch with me, and she was a writing mentor for me during my thesis and has just become a dear friend. And she was one of those people who just never ever lost faith that this book was going to find a home and it would be out there. And so it almost feels, in some ways it feels so appropriate to have her be part of the launch with me because she was there through the whole journey. I also think that I firmly believe that, stories like mine, stories like so many other people's
Hmm.
who lived through that time period, they need to be there to remind us of that
Yes.
period of our history. I mean, there's an entire generation that doesn't know what it was like in the 80s and 90s
Hmm.
when AIDS first came, and just kind of how people responded. And I think without that knowledge, we're kind of destined to repeat things. And we saw some of that, saw some echoes of the discrimination and the prejudice and the stigma that was happening and the isolation as well.
Yes.
And I just think it's important that we continue to talk about these stories. And I think that belief was kind of a driving force. Like, this story is important. I know it's important. And that was kind of a belief that I held on to despite kind of the dejected feeling that you get over time of getting rejected.
Absolutely. And I think I always tell people you need to know who your top 10 are, right? Who are the top 10 people who are your posse, your champions that are going to be there for you through this process because it is a long haul.
It is.
And I'm so glad that you had those people who were able to hold the faith when it was rocky for you because we all get there, right? That's just
Right.
part of the process. And so you had time, right, to think about your project, to consider different ways to position it, different ways to write this. But you also recently finished a certificate program in narrative medicine through Columbia. Can you tell us a little bit about that? And then the next part I want to ask you about is how did both your publication journey and the certificate affect the way you wrote this book?
Sure. So, narrative medicine is a discipline that originated at Columbia Medical School. And it was kind of a belief that one particular person, her name is Dr. Rita Sharon, she is considered kind of the founder of narrative medicine. It began with a belief that if medical practitioners employed kind of narrative tools that we
Mm-hmm.
tend to see in the humanities, right? Like close reading and,
Yes.
prompted writing and, creative work, that it would help kind of bring a more humanistic approach to health.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's where the field originated. And it's become almost a standard in most medical schools that narrative medicine is a part of the educational training of medical practitioners.
Mm-hmm.
But it has expanded, to social work, to, anybody who's kind of in that practitioner role. And what has also happened is there's been a lot of intersection because it's a humanities based discipline. There's been a lot of intersection with artists and writers and musicians and filmmakers to understand, like, how does that work kind of come together. And so as a writer entering a narrative medicine program, my goal was to think about the idea of the lived experience of illness, of caretaking, of witnessing illness, right? And that has also kind of grown within the discipline, the understanding that individual stories of navigating healthcare, dealing with trauma, of being a healthcare practitioner, that those really matter, that the
Mm-hmm.
stories that come out of that help to kind of expand our perspectives within, kind of healthcare and medical practice, right? And so for me, it was the understanding that, I mean, I kind of focused on it from a couple of different perspectives. My father was a physician, so I understood that for him, my mom and dad wrote a book and published it the year my dad died. and about their experience. And I know for my dad, that was a way of making sense of his experience,
Yeah.
right? I think that when we look at, kind of taking a creative approach, an artistic approach to our experiences, it helps us to understand them better. And also, it helps other people to kind of enter into our experiences and recognize how do they differ from our own, and how do we kind of create that affiliation. And so for me, the learning I was doing in narrative medicine really kind of fed my belief that, these individual narratives of the lived experiences are vital and we need more of them in the world. And I think, it prompted me to want to teach more of that, also to help bring people's stories together. And,
Yes.
as writers, that's kind of our most valuable asset is we create kind of a platform for ourselves with our books that opens space for other people to talk about their stories. Nothing more rewarding than being at a book reading and, having somebody come up to you after and say, I really appreciated your book and here's why. And let me tell you my story. Right.
Yes.
And to see those places. And I think that that's how narrative medicine really impacted my thinking about my book, about these kinds of stories.
And that's so beautifully said because our stories are really who we are.
Mhm.
And when we don't see them out in the world, it's kind of like what happened in your family. We think that our stories don't matter, and we also don't know what to do with them.
Right.
So I love that you're doing that. And what I noticed about your book is there was two stories you were telling. There's the story of reclaiming your voice, of deconstructing the silence, of understanding this thing that happened, and also that story of anticipatory grief.
Right.
And you had a lot of different ways you could have put this together.
Right.
And you have this really beautiful way that in some ways matches, I think, the true crime books that I have read, like Alex Marzano's Lesovich, The Fact of a Body, Sarah Perry's After the Eclipse. These are two books I've read recently that have this alternating structure of kind of before and after.
Yeah.
And your book does that, which was surprising to me when I read it. And yet it's brilliant and it works so well because, one of the contracts that happens when we're writing a memoir is like, we know the person survived it. And we know in the first chapter, the dad dies,
Yeah.
right? So we're waiting for that this whole time. And you could have put that early on. I mean, you could have told this as a chronological story and that, that he contracts HIV and then he's sick and then he dies and then I have to figure out how to heal. That's one way to tell a story, but you push us into both at the same time in this way that heightens the tension and also amplifies some of the experience of like the secret. Like you get to a certain place with a story, but then it's like, nope, let's go into this other direction. And you create the sense of withholding around his death. Like you give us a chance to love him and appreciate all of his complexities and then to grieve right alongside you in a way that would not have happened if this was a chronological book. So when in your process did you decide on this fancy pants structure that works so well?
Well, I'll tell you, structure was like the bane of my existence throughout the whole writing process for me. It's interesting. During my MFA, I think it was my second semester, a mentor, kind of her strategy with many of her mentees was, when I start work with a mentee, I'd like you to kind of create a timeline of the
Mm-hmm.
story that you're telling, and I get it, it seems like a straightforward approach. And, so being the good student that I was like, all right, I'm going to do my timeline. And I started kind of creating it, and it just became kind of this tangled mess
Yeah.
of, I couldn't see it in a linear way.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I've always kind of talked about this story of like, I think I carried it as like, those like tangles of yarn, where you have to kind of find the starting thread and then you have to figure out,
Yes.
thread by thread. And that's what it felt like. It just felt like this giant tangled ball. And I kept pulling at these threads and like one would lead to another. And then I kind of felt like there's no way that this can be a linear story
Mm-hmm.
because so much of like there was this parallel journey of like me in the closer here and now
Right.
looking back, and that was such a part of the story as well. And so I really struggled on the structure front. I tried from a chronological perspective, and I was like 70 pages of my dad dying in the in the first part of the book. That's gonna like
Hmm.
send people over the edge. And I knew that it wasn't going to be chronological. Then the question was, well, so then what is it if it's not? And I was fortunate to have read some really lovely memoirs that were nonlinear, and that kind of demonstrated to me that there are different ways that you can structure a story. And so
Yes.
I kind of think of my story in a sense as like a mosaic, that it does have that back and forth structure, but it also kind of has it's thematically based, all these kind of thematic threads that felt important. And so it's divided also kind of into these thematic elements
Hmm.
as well. And that started working for me. And then the one thing, so as you know, having read it, I made a very conscious choice to put scenes from my time in therapy, because I could not have written this book without having gone through that therapeutic process. And the two were
Yes.
actually happening kind of at the same time. I started therapy at the same time I started my MFA, kind of fortuitous. And so I felt like it was an important part of the story. And so the one thing that does have a bit of a linear structure is my time in therapy. What I started to realize is I can use those scenes as kind of benchmark scenes
Hmm.
along the way. They kind of became the forward movement around which all the other stuff threads.
Yeah, and what I love how you've just explained that is so beautifully, because structure can be so complicated, and I think I meet a lot of writers who are interested in telling a story, and they want to start with structure. And of course you do, because you have this big story and there's all these big feelings, and you want to feel like you have some bumpers around the process that don't keep you getting lost in the story. But that's what's beautiful about your book, is that even though it's this mosaic where we're going back and forth and we have these different things happening, I never get lost, and I always felt like the next thing logically flowed from what happened before. So there was this beautiful sense of inevitability. And I think if I'm going to be telling people for a long time to study your book and say, do you want to know how to do nonlinear structure? This is how you do it, because it is so beautiful. And so I'm so glad that you did it that way. So, people who are listening to this podcast might be memoirists who are interested in writing a story for publication. Other people might be interested in writing a story just to heal themselves or understand the story they're telling themselves. What advice do you have for these writers?
Well, I would say, first of all, I think a lot of times when people decide that they're going to write about something, they kind of are like, I'm ready, but then they don't know where to start. And
Yes.
I was very fortunate that one of my first MFA mentor, one thing he said to me kind of in our first little initial meeting was, don't think about the whole. Don't think about this as a book. And he said, I remember him saying, 5 years from now, when you're ready to call it a book,
Hmm.
and I remember at that point, I was like, there's no way I'm going to be writing this book for 5 years. And here we are. It took a decade. But he said, don't think about the overview. Don't think about the big picture. Go small. And he said, just write where the heat is, write what feels important to you right now. And that was such a gift to me, because it meant I didn't have to say like the beginning, right?
Yeah.
Start writing. I just started writing about things that were resonating for me in the moment. So that was incredibly helpful. And so that I would say, just start writing the things that are kind of itching in your brain, the things that feel like they're pulling at you, that you can't seem to kind of leave behind you. Start writing into that. And then wonderful writers and mentors who demonstrate with their books, with their craft talks and things about think and scene, like put yourself
Yes.
in a moment, really think about like one particular moment
Hmm.
in your story that feels resonant, and write the hell out of that moment.
Yes.
And then once you feel like you've done that, find another moment. I think that not thinking about where this is headed can be really helpful as freeing you up at the beginning. And then, as you said, sometimes we're entering into this just because we want to understand the experience first.
Hmm.
I think that's probably the impetus for most memoirists. They kind of
Yes.
start with like, it's not about other people, it's about me. I want
Hmm.
to like Andre Debus says in Writing Hard Stories, in my interview with him, he says, we all know what happened, but when we start writing, it's because we want to figure out what the hell happened.
Yes.
And so I think that is a lot of what starts us writing. And then I think somewhere along the line, for some people, for writers like you, we recognize that there might be something in our story for other people. And we
Yes.
start kind of taking that different approach of like, let's craft this into something that makes it accessible. But if you're
Hmm.
thinking about that from the very beginning, you're probably not going to get to the truth of your experience.
Yes, absolutely. Because when you do that, you are trying to please other people rather than understand your own experience. And I love that quote from Andre Debus. I use it all the time because it's true. And every book has an essential question that it's asking and answering. Like the book is the answer to that question. Marion Roach Smith often calls it the argument. But the first question every book starts with, and every story and everything that we write is what happened and what happened to me. And so I love how you are refocusing people on just look at what happened to you, bear witness to your own experience, understand your feelings around it, figure out what that is. And so now I'm going to get you to do something. If you don't mind, Melanie, will you pick up your book? Hold it to your heart and answer the following question. How does it feel to hold this book and to have come full circle on this experience?
In some ways, it feels really surreal. It feels like I can't believe that I have this book and that I can hold it in my hands. But it also feels very gratifying. It feels like, you know, I've done a lot of work to get to this place, and not just the writerly work, but the
Mm-hmm.
psychological work, the physical work of doing it. And so to come to this place where I'm holding this book, it feels like I remember Richard Hoffman talking about it when he talked about finishing half the house. He said, it felt like he had kind of entered a new place, right? And
Yes.
and that's what I feel like. Like I'm moving into a new space with this book, coming along with me. But it's not this giant weight I'm carrying
Mm-hmm.
that I'm dragging behind me anymore.
What is part of the new story you're telling yourself in this new space that you are now living?
I think I believe in my own voice. I believe that my voice matters, and that what I have to say in the greater context of HIV AIDS, my particular voice matters in that context. I think that it's also, I know that it puts me in a position to talk to people about what I love to talk to people
Mm-hmm.
about, right? I am somebody who leans into hard stories, who leans into emotionally fraught material. And so it gives me the opportunity to move further into that space. And hopefully, I've said all along that if somebody reading this book can say to me, it made me feel less alone, then I've accomplished what I wanted to accomplish in writing this book.
Well, I am so grateful again that you wrote this. And y'all, if you have not got your copy, you need to go buy it. You need to read it and you need to read it again so you can study how masterfully this has been written because it's both a great story and a great tool to understand how stories can be constructed. So thank you so much, Melanie. If people were going to follow you in any one place, what is the best place for them to follow you?
Well, so first of all, let me say thank you to you, Lisa. And when Lisa was talking about like those 10 people that you need to have in your circle, she's been one of my people. And so I'm grateful to you for your ongoing support, and just doing this, is another way to continue to support. If you want to connect with me, you can contact me through my website, melaniebrooks.com. That's also where you'll find news and updates about my book tour. You can find me on Facebook. You can find me on Instagram. I'm Melanie J.M. Brooks Writer. And on Twitter, which is now X, I'm at Melanie J.M. Brooks.
And if you didn't have time to write that down, this will appear in the show notes. So you will have access to that. And this is a question I'm starting to ask writers because sometimes it matters and sometimes it doesn't. Is there a preferred way that you would like people to buy your book?
I always encourage buying from the independent bookseller in your area. I am a huge supporter of independent bookstores. So if you have an independent bookstore in your area, go to them, ask them to stock the book, ask them if you can order from them. But it can also be found in some of the other standard places as well. You can find it on Amazon, you can find it at Barnes and Noble as well.
Yes, support your local bookstores. So important for 1,000 reasons we could have a whole session on. And also, once you read her book and you love her book, I want you to write some beautiful testimonials and some reviews and put them on Goodreads, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and anywhere else you can, because this is how we support and love each other. And I am so grateful to have you as part of my top 10 as well. It is such a blessing to have you in my life. And I am so excited about where this is going to take you. So thank you so much, Melanie. I am so glad you're here.
Thank you, Lisa.
Hey writers, have you started a memoir only to get lost in a sea of stories that never seems to end, or completed a few drafts and now wonder if the structure you've chosen for your memoir is the best one for your book? Or have you queried a few agents only to hear, sorry, it's not for me, or worse, radio silence? You might not know this, but structure is the concept writers struggle with most. They worry about it during their first drafts and all along the way. There's a very good reason why this happens. An ineffective structure can lose readers, trap you in an endless cycle of revision, or worst of all, get you so lost you give up. But that doesn't have to happen to you. On February 21st, I'm teaming up with Jane Friedman to bring you Find the Memoir Structure That Works for You. During this webinar, you'll discover why writers crave structure and why stories need them. You'll also learn how to assess your skills and vision for this project, explore the most common memoir structures, and find out what skills are needed to nail each one. Best of all, it's only $25. That's right, $25. Plus, you don't even have to be available on February 21st because everyone who registers will get the recording, transcript, Q&A, and my comprehensive workbook. To learn more or register, go to janefriedman.com/courses, or make it super easy on yourself and just click the link in the show notes. You'll leave with a new understanding of not just how stories are told, but confidence in your vision for your book, as well as a clear plan for getting there. To find the memoir structure that works for you, click on the link in the show notes, then register for this course. That's it for today's episode. Before you leave, I would love your help spreading the word about this podcast. You can do this in a few very simple ways. Click on the subscribe button in the upper right-hand corner, then leave a 5-star review. You can also let me know what you think or share ideas for the podcast by connecting with me on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, or through my Writing Your Resilience newsletter, which you can have delivered directly to your inbox.